Ladies and gentlemen, and they. It gives me a great pleasure. I've got to know people over the day, and it's been a wonderful and rich day for us all. And you have extraordinary, shall we say, absolutely extraordinary capacity for endurance. I think you should congratulate yourself on endurance, because it's been a big and a very, very rich day for us. And our keynote speaker, and not just our one keynote speaker, but we've also got Oran here, and also, oh my gosh, Steve here. So we've actually had 3 keynote speakers who've engaged with us all day, which is so fantastic. But for tonight, it's my very, very special pleasure to actually introduce Professor Jane Rendell, from a Professor of Architecture and Art at Bartlett School of Architecture at University College London. And I guess perhaps a little bit of context. Jane and I met, gosh, rather a long time ago at the School of Slade, but it was actually on the advice of Marie Sierra that at the ACUADS, I think it was 2014, she said, we must get Jane Rendell to be our keynote. And so the last time I saw Jane was on this screen as this huge effigy looking down upon us. And in that keynote, Jane talked about her own practice of ethics, and that was before this project was up, her own practice of ethics, which began for her in 2013 when she questioned her own university, that is the UCL, decision to accept $10 million of funding from the Anglo-Australian multinational mining and petroleum company BHP Billiton. So that was such an inspirational presentation for all of us sitting out where you're sitting today. When we started talking about this project, of course, Jane was the first person that we thought of. And as it would happen, Jane was here earlier this year, and we set this in motion that she would be our keynote for tonight. So I think that just I'm keeping a very brief, but Jane is a key UK researcher concerned with ethics, and is currently actually involved in because it's a different system in the UK, but she's actually involved in setting up the ethics protocols for her faculty, which is an enormous job. So I guess with that and all her other publications and all her research, I think that says enough that Jane comes from a position where a personal ethic is very important, which she takes into the workplace, and she's bringing that position here tonight. And Jane, it's fantastic, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being such a part of our conference.
Thank
so
you.
everybody, welcome Jane.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, it's an absolute honour to be here. I'm here as a guest. It's an enormous privilege to be able to come to Australia in the first place, but even more so to be asked to deliver a keynote on what's been an extraordinary conference so far for me. So absolutely to my hosts, to Barb and Megan. I don't know if Megan, I can't quite see Megan. Oh, there, behind the screen. Megan, Kate and Pia, and other members of the team. Thank you so much for inviting me, and also for applying for the funding to get me here, and also giving me some time to adjust to the jet lag before the conference, which is much appreciated. And to the occupants, past and present, I also pay my respects. I think dealing with the history of country in Australia is something that I find incredibly humbling. I don't really have the words or experience to talk of it, and I don't want to talk out of place. And so I just want to refer to something Richard said this morning, which really touched me, that art is a voice, that voice is a kind of freedom, and with freedom comes responsibility. I thought that was so beautifully put. So a second thanks really is for this project overall. I think it's an amazing project. I really think it is the cutting edge of ethics work in fine art practice, design practice as well. And I've certainly already learned a huge amount, which I'm going to take back to a kind of parallel project that I'm engaged in at UCL, which I'll touch on as I go through my presentation. And hopefully, I really hope we can continue. There are some in the room who I've already been collaborating with, some for many years, and I hope we can continue this collaboration. I think it's very important work, and I can really tell from all the presentations today that people are very dedicated. People who engage in this area are very, very dedicated to it. You don't pass through it lightly, I don't think. Third thing just to say as a kind of part of an intro is that the talk I'm going to give tonight is part of a much bigger project, which I've been working on for many years. It's an ongoing project. It's really around homework displacements, which uses my own life as a kind of register to try and calibrate the privatisation of the public sphere in the UK in the last 5 years, ongoing situation there, particularly social housing in London and the demise, if you like, of the public university on the other hand. It's very specific then, but I hope that in some way this kind of slice of life will connect to the general as well. Apologies to Steve, who I think will be hearing the fourth version of this, and Marie, who's probably, it's the second, I think Barb the second, don't know for others. So this is a kind of live and direct project, so it's constantly changing. I keep curating the different voices within it. I make it different each time. So tonight, I've tried to focus very much on the relation of ethics to critique. To do that, I've had to take out some voices. So for example, something I'm working on a lot at the moment is the voice of the corporation and how they describe themselves. I've had to remove that tonight. That might be too much of a gap. And so it's just one version of this ongoing project. So I think I'll, without further ado on that, begin the paper. Giving an account of oneself architecturally. The fear that woke my stomach reaches my head. Wide awake in a still dark bedroom, I realise that when morning comes, I'll have to outline the research I've conducted for UCL's risk register. Tasked to own the risk of research expansion, I focus on UCL's reputation as a global research leader and its academic reputation based on independence and integrity. I will suggest that one of the risks associated with research expansion comes from accepting financial gifts from corporations, particularly where there are disparities between the practices of those corporations and UCL's principles as published in its core principles and procedures, which I won't go into here, but there are many of them. I'm focusing in particular on UCL's decision to accept funding from the charitable arm of BHP Billiton, one of the world's largest mining corporations, in June 2011 to set up an Institute of Sustainable Resources, the ICR at UCL, and position this inside the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment in September 2012. If we follow the Brundtland Report of 1987, which states that sustainable development must be development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, then the mining of fossil fuels is unsustainable on two counts. First, fossil fuels are a finite research, and second, as published climate science evidence says, the limit of the ecosystem to absorb CO2 has already been dangerously surpassed. I'll argue that UCL is taking a risk with its reputation for independent research into sustainability, allowing BHP Billiton to buy legitimacy for the continued mining of fossil fuels and to potentially influence not only policy on sustainability, but also the definition of this contested term. I've judged the risk of potential damage to reputation to be significant enough to warrant purchasing a copy of a report by RepRisk on BHP Billiton. So RepRisk, as they describe themselves, the RepRisk index is a quantitative risk measure that captures criticism and identifies a company's or project's exposure to controversial environmental, social, and governance issues. It doesn't measure a company's or project's overall reputation, rather it is an indicator of a company's or project's reputational risk. 22nd of January 2013, greenpeace.org. The report, Point of No Return, published by Greenpeace with research from the environmental consultancy Ecofys, has expressed serious concerns about a boost in mining, oil and gas extraction by major multinational companies, including Adaro Energy, BHP Billiton, Gazprom, Peabody Energy, Vale and others. The report claims that the projected activities of these companies could lead to a 20% increase in CO2 levels, as well as an increase in 5 to 6 degrees in global temperature by 2020. The report also argues that environmental impacts of such changes could lead to impacts on food supplies and a series of social upheavals. The post-critical. And this is a very specific debate in architecture. It doesn't happen in quite the same way in fine art. In Notes Around the Doppler Effect and Other Moods of Modernism, Robert Sommel and Sarah Whiting rejected the autonomous disciplinarity and oppositional dialectics of critical architecture, as represented by the work of Michael Hayes and Peter Eisenman. They described this as hot representation and instead advocated an architecture of the diagrammatic, the atmospheric, and cool performance. At the time, this is around a decade ago, this paper established what appeared to be a dominant post-critical mood in architectural education, but it left many of us wondering otherwise. I asked myself in Critical Architecture, a book I co-edited at that time, if, following Raymond Geiss, in turn following Karl Marx, critical theory could be defined in terms of self-reflectivity and the desire for social emancipation, then cannot any activity which takes on these tasks be considered critical? Since government funding to cover teaching costs has been all but removed in the UK, increasing efforts are being made to attract a new income stream, corporate sponsorship. But with so much talk of business links and enterprise, there's been very little institutional acknowledgement of the shifts in culture occurring in universities as a result of the reduction of state funding and the introduction of loans for UK students at BA level. Yet I'm reminded that UCL is not a public university, but a chartered corporation. But if not public, UCL is still proud of its radical tradition, the fact that unlike Oxford and Cambridge, it was not founded as a religious entity. It was the first British university to accept women students on the same basis as men and award degrees to women. And in fact, quite recently, being radical has become key to our brand. A briefing from the communications team suggests that we should speak in a radical and open voice. 6th of February 2013, the Financial Times. The government of Peru's apparent effort to welcome copper-producing companies such as Xstrata, BHP Billiton, Candente Copper and Chinalco has generated negative response from the indigenous communities and caused more than 200 concession-related conflicts in Peru. Riots in Cajamarca related to Newmont Mining Minas Conga project have raised concerns amongst the National Mining Society and human rights activists who reported as many as 16 dispute-related deaths since 2011. Due to time, some of these newspaper reports are important because they bring the external world time into this, but I'm actually going to reduce them not because they're not important, but because I'd like us have a respect for you in the audience and the need to wrap up at a reasonable hour. But if you do want the whole report, I make that available. Critical spatial practice. In a book published in 2006 called Art and Architecture, A Place Between, I coined the term critical spatial practice to define modes of self-reflective artistic and architectural practice which seek to transform and question the social conditions of the sites into which they intervene. Through the process of writing the book, I came to understand that my own position between art, architecture and critical theory was constantly changing and influenced the interpretive accounts I was able to offer. I concluded the book by arguing that the writing of criticism is itself a form of situated practice, one that is critical and spatial, among other things. Before dawn, almost every night now, I'm jolted awake, surprised and disorientated for a second or two, and then I remember and the panic rears up through me. Will fighting this battle, pitting myself against my institution, lose me my job? Has UCL done its homework? And even if it has, will the right governance structures and due diligence procedures really be able to protect the independence of academic research? UCL has argued that we must engage with businesses in order to change them. But I still can't grasp the stated logic that on the one hand, when the funding is at arm's length, the giver of the gift, in this case a charitable donation, should not influence the research that is funded by the gift it has given, but that on the other hand, the receiver of the gift should influence the activities of the giver. 11th March 2013, El Espectador online. The Zenu indigenous community in Colombia claims that they've neither benefited from BHP Billiton's Cerro Matoso ferronickel mine, nor have been fully informed about the mining operations. The mine has allegedly caused deforestation, dried up river sources, water sources, and has contaminated the water with zinc and nickel. Cerro Matoso has admitted that nickel is suspected of causing cancer, and there's been an increase in this type of disease in local population. In 2011, there were reportedly 12 miscarriages out of a total of 36 pregnancies. Relational critique. If criticism can be defined by the purpose of providing a commentary on a cultural work, then criticism always has an other in mind. The central task of criticism might then be considered as, how does one relate to another? Grounded in the objects relations theory of D.W. Winnicott, the psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin argues that the central task of psychoanalysis is the double task of recognition, how analyst and patient make their own subjectivity and recognise the others. Did I really record him in his own office on my mobile phone? Was that wise? I asked him, this is very, very carefully worded. I asked him for permission, explaining that it was so I could remember exactly what he had said without having to take notes, and that the information would not go public. He agreed, and the information has not gone public. I was very friendly about it, and so was he. So maybe it's all fine. But trying to find these documents has turned me into a researcher of my own institution. Did it set up a note of mistrust, having the phone there on the desk between us? What if a colleague who had come to talk to me on a complex and tricky issue had asked to record me? Would I be fine about it? 25th of April 2013, the Australian Associated Press. BHP Billiton challenged to safeguard environment in Olympic Dam expansion. Green members of South Australia's Parliament have challenged BHP Billiton to spend more to protect the environment in its proposed Olympic Dam extension project. The final terms of the Australian $30 billion project are still being negotiated between the company and the SA government, but BHP Billiton reportedly keeps citing cost as an issue in a number of decisions that concern the community, such as lining only 4% of the highly toxic tailings dam, using fossil fuels in the expansion project's power plants, and increasing their take of ancient water from the Great Artesian Basin. The Green MPs urged the company to use its expected 21 billion Australian dollar profits to safeguard the SA environment. Institutional critique. Benjamin Buchloh coined the term institutional critique to describe a strand of conceptual practice developed through the work of artists such as Hans Hacker and Michael Asher in the 60s and 70s. In the Claire Copley Gallery, Los Angeles, in 1974, for example, Asher removed the partition between the office and the exhibition space, revealing to the public viewer the usually hidden operations that allow the gallery to function economically. I'm so angry I can barely breathe. I'm expected to back decisions that have been made without consulting me. I always knew the vice dean role came with responsibility, but I never really understood the implications and potential contradictions of holding such a title until now. It's hard not to wonder if I was excluded from the decision-making process because I'm a woman. But perhaps not, as along with the 5 men who signed the partnership between UCL and BHP Billiton, there was one woman. And actually that kind of information is in the public realm. So if you Google UCL BHP Billiton, you will have photographs of the signing agreement. So this is not breaking any kind of confidentiality clause. It's all there in the public realm. 24th of May 2013, wdm.org.uk, so that's the World Development Movement. HSBC has been criticised by the World Development Movement for allegedly bankrolling climate change through its financing of dirty fossil fuel projects across the world. For example, HSBC has, together with Barclays, Lloyds and RBS, that's Royal Bank of Scotland, supported the Sierra Leone coal mine by providing £3.1 billion British pounds to the companies behind the project, namely Anglo-American, Xstrata and BHP Billiton. Allegedly, the project has, you'll hear that word repeated often in this presentation, allegedly, the project has destroyed entire villages populated by indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, failed to bring jobs, damaged rivers and habitats, and caused respiratory problems to people and workers. Moreover, the mine has allegedly exploited cheap labour and pro-union workers were either intimidated, dismissed or killed, as in the case of the Sintro carbon leader in 2008. Situated knowledge. In visual and spatial culture, feminists have drawn extensively on psychoanalytic theory to think through relationships between the spatial politics of internal psychical figures and external cultural geographies. With words such as mapping, locating, situating, positioning, and boundaries appearing frequently, the language of these texts is highly spatialised, and discussions of new ways of being are articulated through spatial concepts such as standpoint theory and situated knowledge. The development of these two terms, particularly through the work of Jane Flax and Doran Haraway, has been key for examining the relationship between the construction of subjects and the politics of location. Put simply, where I am influences what I can know and who I can be. June 2013. As Vice Dean of Research and having been tasked in January 2013 to own the risk of research expansion, I suggest the need for the following 3 documents. 1, the ESG, so environment, social and governance due diligence procedures to be undertaking when deciding whether to accept the funds. 2, the structures and procedures in place to protect academic independence and integrity. And 3, the performance indicators to monitor how this corporation has been changed by its engagement with UCL. ... I'm, for confidentiality reasons, not able to say any more about that. 16th of June 2013, the Sydney Morning Herald. Australian Federal Police have launched an investigation against BHP over alleged bribery in Cambodia, China and Western Australia. US authorities have investigated the same since 2009 and referred it to the AFP and the Australian Securities and Investments Commission in 2010. The probe alleges that Australian nationals working for the company bribed government officials in relation to its projects, including a bauxite mine in Cambodia and a hospitality for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. It's reported that the Australian police initially rejected an inquiry for an unknown reason, but decided to reopen what has been dubbed as one of the country's highest profile corruption cases. Feminist figurations. A key aspect of situated knowledge is the locatedness of personal experience and the relation of one person's knowledge, understanding and experience to another's. Which brings us very much into the field of life writing, biography and autobiography. The The oral historian Linda Sandino draws on the work of Paul Ricoeur to consider how different forms of figuration operate in narration, relating the act of telling to the told, such that oral history might itself be understood as a double interpretive operation in which the narrator recapitulates the told in the telling. Following Ricoeur, she describes the individual in interpreting his or her life appears both as reader and writer, and the story of a life continues to be refigured by all the truthful and fictive stories a subject tells about himself or herself. A life is not how it was, but how it's interpreted and reinterpreted, told and retold. And in the feminist figurations of Donna Haraway and Rosie Bradotti, spatial arrangements are an intrinsic aspect of their storytelling function, specifically the role of actual locations and the cartographies of power relations and the differing positionalities they generate. Bradotti writes, "Figurations are not mere metaphors, but rather markers of a more concretely situated historical positions. A figuration is the expression of one's specific positioning in space and time. It marks certain territorial or geopolitical coordinates, but it also points to one's sense of genealogy, of historical inscription. Figurations deterritorialize, destabilize the certainties of the subject and allow for the proliferation of situated or micro-narratives of self and others." July 2013. The deed is done. On the 1st of July 2013, I formally stepped down from my role as Vice Dean of Research for the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment, UCL, at a meeting of the Research Advisory Group, RAG, of which I was chair. What does this mean? I think it means that I've withdrawn my consent and refused to collaborate. I believe it's the right thing to have done, but is it actually the most effective way to influence the situation? 9th of July 2016, abc.net.au. Australia's Environment Minister has announced the need for more time to evaluate expansion plans for the Abbott Point coal terminal. Commercial fishermen are objecting to the planned dredging of 3 million cubic metres of the Great Barrier Reef and dumping it back into marine waters. They believe this will threaten fish populations in the sea. The fishing industry has also criticised the port operator, North Queensland Bulk Ports, over the lack of consultation during the research stage of the plans. Adani owns the port, but it is managed by Abbott Point Bulk Coal, a subsidiary of Xstrata, BHP Billiton and GVK Hancock, also allegedly involved in the project. So please note in some of these extracts that I'm reading out, this was the state of play on the date of the report. So in most of these projects, quite a lot of change has happened since. In fact, BHP Billiton's no longer involved, as far as I understand it, with Abbott Point, and Abbott Point has actually changed quite a lot since then, and that's the case with many of these stories. Not all of them have developed for the best, but nonetheless, these are just these absolute snapshots in a moment of time. Critique as crisis. Roland Barthes comments that to criticise means to call into crisis. To consider critique as crisis closely mirrored my state of mind when I chose to step down. So fearful was I of institutional repercussions. I was in crisis at the time, doubting my actions and feeling panic going through me like electricity each time I spoke out. Following my formal act of stepping down, I meet various senior managers at UCL to discuss my decision, and to my surprise, they show support for the work I've been doing on reputational risk and express an interest in involving me in developing UCL's ethical procedures and structures. In an act of what I now see as stepping up, I put forward several proposals for action that I will 1. Prepare a report based on the BHP Billiton donation on existing due diligence procedures and performance indicators in place at UCL for accepting and monitoring funding from corporations for research. Well, that hasn't happened, but, well, I haven't done it, but others at UCL have actually put such a thing in place now. 2, help UCL develop ethical procedures for accepting and monitoring funding from corporations for research. As I say, that's now in place. initiate a research project on the role of influence in the corporate funding of university research based on specific UCL case studies. That hasn't happened yet, but I still think it's increasingly a really important piece of work that needs to be done. Draft a proposal for divestment in fossil fuel, looking at those corporations and companies in which UCL invests its funds and those corporations, companies from which UCL accepts gifts, donations, sponsorship, etc. More on that shortly. Host a public debate on the funding of universities by fossil fuel corporations to involve a range of speakers with diverse views on the topic. More to come. Write an academic article on competing narratives in the contested arena of sustainable communities. Well, this is what you're hearing. 28th July 2013, the Sydney Morning Herald. A report by the Centre for European Policy Studies and the European Capital Markets Institute has accused BHP Billiton, Vale and Rio Tinto of taking advantage of their dominant position in the global freight industry to control the price of iron. CEPS and ECMI have called for this sector to be open to greater competition to counter the oligopolistic behaviour of these companies. CEPS and ECMI have also accused Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan of deliberately trying to increase the price of aluminium through the purchase of a number of aluminium warehouses in the US. This, the think tanks argue, ultimately leads to higher prices for consumers. Constructive institutional critique. The artist and architect Apollonia Sustasik has suggested that institutional critique doesn't produce any constructive resolution when it doesn't affect changes in our political and cultural structures. Her comment was made in conversation with the curator Maria Lind, who's put forward the idea of constructive institutional critique to describe the work of Sustasik and others, which, rather than being based on negativity, offers a proposal for change, possibly an improvement or a test of how to do things slightly differently, based on a dialogue between the artist and the institution, rather than an inherent conflict. Conducted under Chatham House rules and involving senior managers, academics, administrative staff and students at UCL, I host rich seams and dark pools, which Steve will remember well, being present there. Fossil fuel funding and university research was the kind of core title. This was a seminar where 8 speakers addressed what's at stake when fossil fuel funds university research on sustainability. The title of the event refers to a tension between fossil fuel funding as a rich seam, an opportunity or resource to be exploited, but also a dark pool, adopting a term used to describe a source of unregulated financial exchange in the corporate world. And it was a pretty extraordinary event because it was under Chatham House rules. I can't really go into all the details, but it did involve the people involved in the securing of the funding, and it was and many student activists. So it was a pretty amazing group of people discussing this. Volkswagen has been criticised for sourcing coltan, copper and other resources from mines with poor human rights records. Critics have alleged that 20% of coltan mined worldwide comes from illegal mines in Congo and other African countries where children are hired and human rights, social and environmental standards violated. In Peru, copper mining has been linked to human rights abuse, displacement and environmental damage as well. And critics have alleged that mining giants BHP Billiton, Rio Tinto, Glencore, Xstrata and Vale have prevented smaller companies with fair mining conditions to establish themselves. NGOs have demanded for companies to penalise suppliers who do not adhere to international standards, and for the German government to ensure human rights standards are addressed in a commodity agreement being discussed with the Peruvian government. Transversality in the group. Winnicott's idea of the transitional object that exists between the mother and the child was an inspiration for the philosopher Felix Guattari's concept of the institutional object. In his work on transversality in psychiatry, Guattari argues that dual relations are always triangular in character, noting that there's always in a real situation a mediating object that acts as an ambiguous support or medium. Guattari calls this third factor the institutional object. His philosophy proposes a new concept, transversality in the group, an unconscious source of action which carries a group's desire. And this, for him, characterises a dimension opposite and complementary to the structures that generate pyramidal hierarchisation. For Guattari, transversality provides the possibility of bringing into the institutional context its constraints, organisation, practices, etc., all those things and relations which normally exist in the background into the foreground for critique. 2014. I find others who are fascinated in a range of ethical issues, some with very different perspectives to my own, but who also wish to look at UCL's governance structures guiding ethical issues and how ethics is configured through different practices and disciplines, pedagogical and professional, in built environment research. To pursue such interests, I put together a research proposal for a year-long project and apply successfully for some internal funding from the Bartlett Small Grant Scheme. As well as involving a participant from each part of the Bartlett and student participants, as well as advisors from across UCL, the project will employ researchers to map those areas of UCL which engage specifically in ethics, involving discourse analysis, literature reviews, ethnographic interviews and seminars, ending in June with a 2-day international conference, Practising Ethics, where speakers from academia and industry, including architects, artists, environmental scientists, fiction writers and urban planners, will offer their ethical viewpoints through panel sessions and roundtables. And that's all available online under Practising Ethics on the Bartlett website. There's some amazing presentations, so if you're interested, please take a look. 24th of July 2014, sineltrainer.org. Trade union Sin Trama has denounced Gekolso and its subcontractor, Diamantec, for having a hostile stance towards trade unions. Criticism against the two companies comes in the context of a general strike by 3,000 workers in the mining industry. Workers from the following mines are also said to be taking part: Cerrejón, La Jaguar, El Descanso, Pribinao, Calarenturas and Ceramatoso. These mines are reportedly owned by BHP Billiton, Drummond and Glencore Xstrata. Striking workers have accused Gekolso of circumventing labour laws by hiring Diamantec as contractor. Diamantec workers are said to be subject to poorer working conditions than Gekolso workers despite performing the same work. The companies have also been accused of refusing to take part in negotiations with trade unions, of cutting water and electricity from the accommodation of striking workers, and giving higher salaries to workers who won't join a trade union. The art of not being governed quite so much. In Judith Butler's close analysis of Michel Foucault's 1978 lecture, What is Critique? From the Politics of Truth, she notices how critique is always a critique of some instituted practice, discourse, episteme, institution, and it loses its character the moment in which it is abstracted from its operation and made to stand alone as a purely generalizable practice. She talks of how for Foucault, critique is precisely a practice that not only suspends judgment but offers a new practice of values based on that very suspension. Butler points to the way in which the practice of critique emerges from the tear in the fabric of our epistemological web, and outlines that for Foucault, this exposure of the limit of the epistemological field is linked with the practice of virtue, as if, and this is a quote, virtue is counter to regulation and order, as if virtue itself is to be found in the risking of established order. Along with colleagues from the Bartlett, the Medical Faculty, Laws, and the Institute of Global Health, we hold a debate in UCL on divestment. At the end of the discussion, we take a vote. The wish to divest from fossil fuels is almost unanimous. As part of the debate, I argue that UCL has 3 ethical reasons to divest from fossil fuels. First, that investment in fossil fuel companies is inconsistent with many of UCL's strategies. Second, that UCL's own researchers have just produced a paper which argues that certain percentages of fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground. And third, that since universities educate the young, they have a special responsibility to their future. I also point to new economic arguments for divestment. For example, that if international agreements on climate change are met, then investors, by supporting fossil fuel companies, will risk their financial assets becoming worthless. Such investments are creating a carbon bubble worth trillions of dollars based on assets that could be unusable, with coal now being viewed as a stranded asset. I note that, as Brett Scott has recently argued, the two approaches to divestment, ethical and economic, converge in three areas. Firstly, in the campaign to broaden the notion of fiduciary responsibility. Second, in the quest to redefine the time horizon in which investment should be assessed. And thirdly, in the battle to incorporate non-monetary returns and losses into investment assessments. March 2015, apublica.org. Petrobras and Brazil's National Agency of Petroleum have been criticised for extracting oil and gas from Brazil's Whales Park pre-salt campus in Campos Bay in the Brazilian state of Espírito Santo. Pre-salt extraction is allegedly carried out at 7,000-metre depth, but the additional network of rigs, rail, road and port complexes are reportedly threatening the survival of both local and indigenous communities along the whole coast, recognised as an area of rich biodiversity. Fishermen report that industrial activity is disorientating migratory fish and turtles, harming corals and the seafloor. Local communities claim they've not been informed about the different projects. Various oil and gas-related projects have been criticised, including North-South Capiscabo gas pipeline, the Barrio do Riacho liquid gas terminal, the UFN4 unit, the Jurong Aracruz shipyard. Other industrial projects criticised in Espírito Santo include the San Marco mining complex operated by BHP Billiton and Vale SA, the pulp processing processes of Februari and Iguaçu. Consultancy companies have been criticised for submitting misleading environmental impact studies. The signature mark. According to Foucault, the signature mark of the critical attitude and its particular virtue is governance. How not to be governed like that? By that, in the name of those principles, with such and such an objective in mind, and by means of such procedures. Not like that, not for that, not by them. I would propose, says Foucault, as the very first definition of critique, this general characterisation, the art of not being governed quite so much. Over the same time period that I'm deliberating what it means for UCL to accept a financial gift from a fossil fuel company, UCL start to engage with the Research Concordat for Integrity, which is a UK-wide agreement that all universities follow. It's been endorsed through what was HEFCE, the UK Higher Education Council, which is now transformed under recent government. And to review its own research ethics procedures. In tandem with UCL's work in this area, and with the support of the Dean of the Bartlett, Alan Penn, I decide that the research project on ethics that I'm leading needs to transform itself into a working group and to establish a new approach for engaging with ethical issues in the Bartlett through research, but also teaching and enterprise. Starting out with the Bartlett's 4 key principles of autonomy, integrity, sustainability, and equity, I'm keen to set in motion an approach where the implications that these principles raise is followed through in the ethical stance we take in our work as researchers, whether through partnering with corporations, interviewing subjects, or conducting participatory action research. My aim is to set up a Bartlett Ethics Forum and to place ethics as a key aspect of our pedagogy from the education of first-year architects onwards, while also offering a training to staff and guidance to students on how to deliberate ethical dilemmas in their work as future built environment professionals. September 2015, ncoal.org. BHP Billiton is being criticised for defending the coal industry in light of the upcoming UN climate change conference in December 2015. Allegedly, the company, along with industry groups such as Minerals Council of Australia and New South Wales Minerals Council, are attempting to undermine renewable energy efforts and crack down on anti-coal activism while strengthening coal lobbying strategies. The company's 2007 climate change policy has also been criticised for loopholes, where the company is accused of contradicting earlier statements that supposedly support climate change reduction. This is a much longer entry, but I'll leave it at that. I think that's the core point here. The question of who one is. Foucault understands ethical work to have both an intellectual and a practical dimension. For Foucault, according to Paul Rendell, who one is emerges acutely out of the problems with which one struggles. Rendell discusses how Foucault saw this as an attitude, rooted in an ethics and not a morality, a practice rather than a vantage point, an active experience rather than a passive waiting. I really think we've seen that through all the work that's been presented so far today, this idea of ethics as a practice and an active experience. October 2015. In Practising Ethics, Positionality, Spatiality and Subjectivity in Dialogue, a conference I organised for PhD students doing practice-led work, we explore some of the more general ethical principles drawn from medicine that universities use as guiding principles for working with human subjects, or people, as the last presenter described them, such as informed consent, confidentiality, and benefit, not harm. Those are our kind of three core ethical principles at UCL. Drawing on their own experiences as students, supervisors, practitioners, and researchers, speakers from geography, psychoanalysis, ethnography, political science, and architectural design, and the visual performing arts offer a much more nuanced understanding of the possible spatial, cultural, and political settings involved in conversing and engaging with others, and draw out questions around the positions we take up when speaking and listening. They examine how these actions of communication are informed by the psychic structures of subject-object relations and subject-subject relations, and the dynamics of power and knowledge around speech and sight that vary according to practice and discipline. 1st October 2015, World Wildlife Fund. In their Safeguarding Outstanding Natural Value report, the World Wildlife Fund UK and partner organisations have warned of the threats posed by the extractive industries to approximately 70 out of 229 National World Heritage Sites, which support many of the world's most critically endangered species. Environmental damage caused by extractive activities can include reduced biodiversity, habitat loss and fragmentation, introduction of invasive species, and pollution. BHP Billiton is mentioned there, which is all these extracts come from this rep risk index, and the way that works is a search engine that basically rep risk use to pick up any article which has BHP Billiton in it, which they then start to categorise in terms of minor, moderate and severe criticism, and then they produce a kind of diagram of where the company is at any given moment in terms of the risk, reputational risk. Giving an account of oneself. In Giving an Account of Oneself, Judith Butler argues that the I has no story of its own that is not also a story of a relation or a set of relations to a set of norms. She goes on to note that if the I is not at one with moral norms, this means that the subject must deliberate on these norms, and that part of such a deliberation will entail a critical understanding of the social genesis and meaning of these norms. She writes, "In this sense, ethical deliberation is bound up with the operation of critique. And critique finds that it cannot go forward without a consideration of how the deliberating subject comes into being and how a deliberating subject might actually live or appropriate a set of norms. Not only does ethics find itself embroiled in the task of social theory, but social theory, if it is to yield non-violent results, must find a place for this I." October 2015, UCL is still accepting funds from BHP Billiton, but we host the first meeting of a new informal research network of UCL academic researchers and practitioners with our public engagement partner, the London Mining Network, to explore the ecological, economic, political, psychological, social and spatial impacts of mining on individuals and communities. Not only the physical and material sites of the mines themselves, but the constellation of sites associated with them, real, represented and imagined. Our speakers, invited to the UK by the London Mining Network and the Colombian Solidarity Campaign, come to London to attend the BHP Billiton AGM and talk at various events about their first-hand experiences of human rights issues connected with the construction and expansion of the Cerrejón open-cast coal mine in Colombia, which is joint-owned by Anglo-American BHP Billiton and Glencore. We bear witness to the evidence of Samuel Arogos, who is on the committee of the Federation of Communities of African Descent affected by mining in La Guajira. Samuel is from the village of Tobacco, where a community of small-scale farmers of African descent were brutally evicted in 2001 to make way for the expansion of the Cerrejón open-cast coal mine in the province of La Guajira in the far north of Colombia. The construction of the mine has led to the forced removal and dispersal of a number of rural communities, the violation of indigenous cultural sites and sacred values, including those of the Wayuu, and the loss of livelihood among small-scale farmers. We also hear from Danilo Uria of Friends of the Earth Colombia and coordinator of the National Centre of Health, Environment and Work, who's been accompanying the communities affected by the mine and investigating its social and environmental impacts. He's working with communities and organisations in La Guajira to prevent Cerrejón coal diverting local rivers for mine expansion, and with many other organisations to challenge the Colombian government's policy of encouraging large-scale foreign-owned open-cast mining. 25th October 2015, the Sunday Herald, Scotland. A new analysis by Friends of the Earth Scotland has revealed that the GBP multi-million pension fund for members of the Scottish Parliament invests in companies behind weapons, fossil fuel and tobacco, despite the threats they pose to communities' health and environment. The biggest portion of the pension fund, which amounts to £2.1 million, reportedly went to Rio Tinto, Alcoa, Snam Gas, Total and 11 other coal, oil, gas companies known for their carbon emissions. Another beneficiary, BHP Billiton, has accused of negatively impacting communities in Colombia. And it goes on because it's also a fund that's involved in military weapons. But again, I won't read the whole entry. Parisia. In the autumn of 1983, Foucault gave 6 lectures at the University of California, Berkeley, exploring the practice of Parisia in the Greek culture of 4th and 5th centuries BC. He examined the evolution of the term with respect to rhetoric, politics and philosophy, and investigated the link between Parisia and concepts of frankness, truth, danger, criticism and duty. November 2015, I fly to Australia, to the Tasmanian College of the Arts in Hobart, to take up a temporary position as a thinker in residence. While there, in response to an invitation by the Journal of Visual Culture, I start to write the piece I promised UCL back in July 2013 on competing narratives and contestations around sustainability. Taking a break, I meet my longtime friend and colleague Steve Liu for a coffee. An avid newsreader, it's Steve who alerts me to a major BHP Billiton-related disaster that's just occurred in Brazil. Shortly afterwards, I set off on the next part of my research trip to Broken Hill and Olympic Dam to continue my research into BHP's history and current practice. Time is short, so to get there, I take some flights. This is against the advice of my partner, artist and environmentalist David Cross, who gave up flying in 2004 because he refused to contribute to its devastating ecological impact. I know he's right. It is hypocritical to fly while taking up this flight. At the airport, I pick up a copy of the Australian Financial Review. So this is on my way to Broken Hill, which is the founding site of BHP Billiton. On the front page is an image of BHP Billiton's CEO, Andrew Mackenzie. He's described as weeping and experiencing heartbreak, and he appears to be holding his hand over his heart. On closer inspection, it seems to be his left hand over the right-hand side of his body, and so and so. 11th November 2015, BBC.com. Reportedly, the ruptures of the San Marco, Santarém and Fundão tailing dams in the Brazilian municipality of Mariana on November 5th, 2015, spilled a mixture of ore residues and mud equivalent to 25,000 Olympic pools with serious social and environmental impacts. Following the ruptures, the Minas Gerais State Secretary of Environment suspended the operating licence in San Marco, a joint venture between BHP Billiton and Vale, while the international articulation of those affected by Vale staged a process claiming that BHP failed to take adequate measures to minimise the impacts. Reportedly, the Mariana incident is the latest in a list of controversial BHP projects, 3 explosions at BHP's coal mines in Australia, which occurred in 79, 86 and 94, respectively, killing tens of people. Again, in Australia, BHP's Olympic Dam has been opposed to the large amount of radioactive waste produced and the high water consumption, and in 1999, BHP admitted that it had dumped millions of tonnes of waste from the OK Teddy mine in Papua New Guinea into the OK Teddy and Fly rivers for over a decade, affecting 120 communities and 50,000 people. BHP's Escondida mine in Chile has been accused of spilling copper waste, and BHP's Indo-Met project in Indonesia has been opposed for environmental and social issues. So 11th of November 2015, not a good day for BHP. A personal relation to truth. Foucault summarises his thinking from those first few Parisia lectures as follows. Parisia is a kind of verbal activity where the speaker has a specific relation to truth through frankness, a certain relationship to his own life through danger, a certain type of relation to himself or other people through criticism, self-criticism or criticism of other people, and a specific relation to moral law through freedom and duty. More precisely, Parisia is a verbal activity in which a speaker expresses his personal relation to truth and risks his life because he recognises truth-telling as a duty to improve or help other people, as well as himself. February 2016. On the 10th of February 2016, I take the motion that UCL should commit to divesting from the fossil fuel industry and shifting those funds to ethical investments in renewable energy in 5 years to UCL's academic board. The motion passes with 50 votes for and 18 votes against. This is minuted, along with the comment that this sentiment be raised through Council to the Ethical Investments Reviews Committee, of which I'm a member. February 2016, the Financial Times. We're very, very near the end now. Brazilian police have requested for the arrest of San Marco's chief executive and 6 others having been charged with homicide linked to the collapse of the Minas Dam in November 2015. They've also been accused of endangering public health after the collapse of the dam. Note of the Rep Risk Analyst, this refers to the Fundão tailings dam, which is part of the Germano mine, which spewed mining waste and polluted drinking water. Reports claim that the incident, which was considered by the government to be Brazil's worst environmental disaster, led to the death of 17 people, buried communities, and displaced a total of 725 people. The incident has also resulted in legal cases, including a $5.1 billion US dollars lawsuit by Brazil's Attorney General, state and federal prosecutor lawsuits demanding compensation to damages, as well as plea to freeze 500 million Brazilian of San Marco's assets to guarantee town repairs. San Marco is a joint venture between Vale and BHP Billiton. Bios and Logos. Towards the later lectures on Parisia, Foucault turns to examine the function of Parisia in terms of the crisis of democratic institutions, and moves on to discuss how Parisia occurs as an activity in human relations with respect to oneself and care of the self, and in relation to others, specifically through 3 kinds of relation: individual, personal, community, and public life. And here Foucault talks of how in the shift from a political to a Socratic or ethical form of Parisia, the relation between logos, truth, and courages courage alters to include bios and to focus on the balance between bios and logos with respect to truth. So he writes, here, giving an account of your life, your bios, is not to give a narrative of the historical events that have taken place in your life, but rather to demonstrate whether you are able to show that there's a relation between the rational discourse you are able to use and the way that you live. Socrates is inquiring into the way that logos gives form to a person's style of life, for he's interested in discovering whether there's a harmonic relation between the two. March 2016. I have to call a security guard to find the room. It's empty of the committee when I arrive, but the secretary is preparing coffee and making the finishing touches to the paperwork. Tucked away at the top of a rather strange dog-legged staircase is the provost's dining room, just large enough to hold a table for an intimate dinner for 6 or maybe at a stretch 10. On the 14th of March 2016, it's the location of what I discover is likely to be the last meeting of the Ethical Investments Reviews Committee, of which I'm a member. We're told that as part of the Governance Effectiveness Review being conducted by UCL Council, it seems likely that the AHRC will no longer be required. In the future, I'm thinking, it will no longer be necessary for academics to be involved in making decisions concerning ethical investments. Instead, the work is to be subcontracted. Investment consultants Saracen have prepared for a number of universities, including UCL, a proposal for a climate active endowment fund constructed on socially responsible investment principles. It strikes me, given last month's vote at Academic Board, that this might be a convenient way to avoid the potential and actual offence caused by divesting from those fossil fuels companies from whom we also accept funding. March 2016, the Financial Times. San Marco Minerajo has appealed a 112 million Brazilian fine imposed by Brazil's Secretariat of the Environment and Sustainable Development in the state of Minas Gerais in November 2015 for the environmental disaster that resulted from the rupture of the company's Fundeo tailings dam. According to the agency, an inspection of the dam on August 7, 2015, detected deficiencies in the project's embankment and equipment, as well as some erosion at the site. Separately, Minas Gerais has jointly fined San Marco, a Serviço Autónomo de Água e Esgoto, with a bill of 75 million, again Brazilian currency, for using chemicals in water treatment and discharging waste into the Rio Doce River. Moreover, San Marco reportedly has outstanding fines with the Brazilian Institute of Environment and Renewable Natural Resources, totaling 250 million. Vale and BHP, San Marco's owners, have both faced investor lawsuits in the US in connection with San Marco's environmental scandal in Brazil, while US investors filed a claim against Vale in the district court in New York. BHP allegedly faces a new class action lawsuit by the Jackson County Employees Retirement Scheme in Michigan. According to the suit, BHP made false and misleading statements about the precarious safety situation of San Marcos facilities in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. Well, that story's updated. If you're interested, the report has now come out. It's on BHP Billiton's website. I was reading it yesterday. Sight writing is a name that I have given to a practice which draws attention to the role of writing in situating critical knowledge. I'm interested in how criticism as a practice performs acts of interpretation, how it's produced by and in turn productive of the changing positions and sites we occupy as critics, materially, conceptually, emotionally, ideologically. Sight writing responds to Howard Cagel's notion of strategic critique, where a position of judgment is advanced through a process of criticising, and parallels Gavin's Butt's call for a mode of contemporary criticality, which is apprehended within and instanced as the performative act of critical engagement itself. 19th of September 2016, I receive an email to say, and actually I realised that I actually can't say any of this because the second part of the decision was taken under confidential business, which means I think it risks a lot to even mention the first part. So all I think I can say is that the Ethical Investment Review Committee is therefore disestablished. On that same day, I sign off the copy for a poster advertising an event I'm organising with my Colombian colleague Diana Salazar called Speech Extractions, Witness Testimony and Evidence in Response to the Mining Industry. The event, organised by the Bartlett and public engagement partner the London Mining Network, is to be a voicing of displacements, dispossessions and environmental disasters that have occurred in response to the activities of the extractive industries. Following J.L. Austin's seminal 1955 lecture series, How to Do Things with Words, in which he discusses the performative capacity of language, these spoken words might be understood as perlocutionary acts, acts in which certain effects are achieved by saying something. The words spoken will be considered in terms of evidence, witnessing and testimony connected with human rights and environmental justice. Speakers are coming from communities in Colombia, Brazil and Indonesia, from legal associations, NGOs and universities. The day will end with a keynote lecture from Professor Aviva Chomsky of Salem State University in Massachusetts, who's been visiting communities in La Guajira, Colombia and other Central American countries for more than 10 years. The event will be preceded by a screening of documentaries related to Brazil and Colombia. It's funded by the Bartlett Sea and Currents Fund and the London Mining Network. And the event is free and open to the public. So maybe I'll see you there. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.